and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader of our Medical and Laboratory business here at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by my first repeat guest, Mr. George Strom from our Connected World team. Hi, George. How are you?
I am fantastic, Clarissa. Thank you for having me back. Always a pleasure to talk about medical compliance with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, very apropos that you are our first repeat guest with all things that we're seeing going on as it relates to cybersecurity and the changes and updates we're seeing from a medical cyber perspective. So for anyone who didn't catch our first episode together, maybe you can give a quick intro to yourself and how you sit in the business here at Intertek.
Absolutely. So I've been with Intertek actually. June, I'll begin my 29th year with Intertek. So I have a wealth of Intertek knowledge that's running around in my brain. I started in the electrical business unit, and when we formed via acquisition our Connected World, I went over there to understand the impact that cybersecurity have on all of our clients. Primarily, I guess our primary focus has been medical, as regulators such as the FDA and the European Union were putting framework out 5 or 6 years ago on what device manufacturers would need to integrate from a cybersecurity perspective. Our primary acquisition of EWA Canada does the bulk of our work for us, and they really have done a great job in becoming insiders in the industry as well, getting involved not only with standard technical panels such as UL 2900 and the IEC 62443, but also on some other very unique standards that are being developed for product categories in conjunction with the FDA. So certainly we're well versed on the changing and the changing in sand, the shifting of the sand, if you would. But it's been a very interesting 5 or 6 years to live this evolution for product-based cybersecurity and medical devices.
Yeah, and not even 5 or 6 years, right? But just the changes we see day to day, month by month, right? There's just so much that's coming out and so much fluidity in this market, right? Things that we see changing really, really rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the last, I would say 18 months have been most drastic, most magnanimous change. Drastic's a bad word. The biggest change, but the biggest change agents that have occurred started about 2022 in March with the FDA coming out with its final pre-market requirements and the final adoption of what they're going to be asked, and right of refusal was launched in April this year. So that was really the biggest shift in the sand that's happened over the past year and a half for device manufacturers. And I must say, I think manufacturers are still very confused on what they have to provide and what is, best practice to provide in their tech files and final submittal.
Yeah, so let's just dive right into that, because I think that's been a big change since the last time we talked, right? This new cybersecurity and medical devices, this document that the FDA released with their right of refusal. So I think it's in come out recently, right? As you said, I think it was the end of March, beginning of April of this year when they put this out here. Right. And it sounds scary to manufacturers, right? That now the FDA is saying, we have this right of refusal. So what exactly did we see with this document coming out from the FDA?
Well, we've seen a couple things. One, we have clients that have actually had tech files kicked back because they had no cybersecurity plan, right? That's probably the most extreme point. You have to, if you have software in your device, right? It also dispels the myth that if it's wireless, it has to be wireless in nature to have cybersecurity. If you read through all the guidance documents on cybersecurity, you start to understand that it looks at the evolution of the software and how software is maintained throughout the life cycle of a product, and how that software, you need to understand when you have patching to that, you have to have a patching plan, you have to understand the vulnerabilities in that software, and ultimately it's going to end with the end of life of that product. So, we're seeing a couple things. We're seeing, we have some clients that may have some unstable platforms out there with antiquated technology. They have to evolve their platform and integrate new software. We're seeing clients that are saying, well, it's not going to impact me because I don't have wireless. These are all myths we have to kind of dispel with people. But it's having a plan on treating your software as if it was almost like a component in your system, and how you stack that software, how you compile your bill of materials, your software bill of materials for your final submittal to the FDA. Very critical time to understand what's in your software, and really kind of dispels, what's been kind of prevalent in the past, 5 or 6 years on the IEC 62304 document. Clients will often say, well, I have a software but unknown presence. And that's, in my opinion, going to go the way of the dodo, because once you understand that you're responsible for the patching of that open source library, whatever it may be, you'll understand what's in your software. And that unknown presence is, you have to understand how you're going to patch it and how you're going to have sustainability of your software.
Yeah, and I think it's super interesting too, as you pointed out, right? We've seen medical device manufacturers for years be worried about getting pushback when they're making regulatory submissions in a variety of areas, right? From the risk management to, the documentation, everything that they put together. And now this cyber piece is, it's actually becoming an area that the FDA is saying, other regulatory agencies are saying, hey, you have to have something documented. You have to have something in place. And we see, the FDA kind of drew this line in the sand with this right of refusal document saying, if you don't have this, we have the right to say, no, we're not going to accept your submission. Now, obviously, right, we can't speak for the FDA, right? We know we don't work for the FDA, but we have worked with them very closely in a lot of different ways and seen how collaborative they want to be and how proactive they want to be at pushing things forward. So do we think the FDA is actually going to refuse? I mean, right, the idea is to push people to do what's right? Not to stop submissions from going through.
Yeah, so they said October would be their drop dead date for right of first refusal. In my opinion, when you are developing your product or you're developing your plan for submittal, I would ask, if I was the manufacturer, best advice I can give is ask the FDA, this is our cybersecurity plan, and have them say it's good enough, or you may want to consider you have cloud connectivity, for example. Seems to be a misnomer that you don't need to have any type of objective evidence on your cloud connectivity, but I would ask the FDA or any regulator, is this good enough? Because you want to make sure you don't have that hiccup when you do submit. And I think that's you have to be a little bit proactive here as a device manufacturer, because there's a critical path here. If you're delayed, and you probably know this date, I think you have X amount of days to reply to the FDA if they file.
Yeah, right.
And,
totally.
and if it's 14 days or 7 days, one of those 2 days come in my mind, but that's not enough time to compile all your information. It's not enough time to effectively do any type of IoT medical device security testing as well, because that can take 3 to 5 weeks. So you, in essence, could, you may have a plan, they may accept the plan, but I would be very proactive on the front end and ask, is this good enough? And certainly we have clients who will take our proposal and ask them, this is what we're going to test our product to. And they share that with the FDA, and that's their decision, because it's once we hand them the proposal, in my opinion, they can leverage it 6 weeks someday. But that's the best advice I would give, is be very proactive.
Well, yeah, and that's a great point too, because you make a submission, right? So if you make a typical 510K and they come back and ask for something major, typically they'll give you, 90 days maybe to respond if they see that you need more testing. But even then, right, 90 days goes by like that, right? I mean,
in a heartbeat, really, it's very quick.
To put a plan together and actually do the testing that you need to do, that goes by really fast. So I think, from a practical standpoint, right, with all of these regulators and the different countries, right, everyone wants to get these safe and effective devices to market, right? The intention when they put out these guidances or guidelines, or now this, very firm document, is not because they don't want medical technology and advanced medical technology getting onto the market.
They absolutely do.
Right?
Yeah, they want it on the market. And I think the biggest change that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years has been non-traditional equipment being used in the home as well. Because then you have, a traditional product that was, historically used in a secure environment, and now it's being used in the home. And there's a lot more risks in that home healthcare sector for cybersecurity than, say, in a hospital or healthcare provider setting. So that's where that proactivity would benefit all manufacturers. And again, I can't say this enough. Proactivity is going to help the manufacturer in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, right, we see, everyone reads the news. We see all of these articles coming out all the time about different medical devices experiencing cybersecurity events, hacks, like, all sorts of different things that happen, right? And all of the regulators notice this as well, right? They want people to take these risks seriously, right? It's not just protecting patient data. It's all of the risks that can be associated with a cyber threat.
It is all the risks. And I think when manufacturers are developing, the device manufacturer developing their threat risk assessment, they have to understand too, and this is really critical, that the what if scenario, if the device is hacked, would it create harm? Would it create harm to the patient? And that's something the manufacturer has to determine. I think there's a lot of questions on, could you write that for me? It's like, well, I don't know what, it's your product. You have to tell us if I have a surgical device and it's hacked, would it create a death experience to the patient. I hope it doesn't. That's a terrible way to think, but that's the worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario if this is hacked? Do they steal patient information? Is the patient harmed? Do they steal the intellectual property of the device manufacturer? Those are probably the three big areas you have to look at. But then you have to go back and, with that assessment and say, do I have evidence to say that this device is secure? Right. So it starts really with understanding what is the risk to the organization, to the patient, to the patient's data.
Absolutely. I think that's so critical. And really understanding, does the risk outweigh the reward, right? Everything you do from a risk analysis perspective in general, right? Looking at, okay, what is this device intended to do? What is this treating? What are the risks that we see? And now really embedding what are those cyber risks on top of it and really looking at it from that perspective. So you talked a little bit about proactivity, right? Sending your plan to the FDA. We see the FDA being really collaborative during pre-submission meetings and providing guidance or providing what they're actually looking for. You talked about how we've had some manufacturers even send, a quote or plan that we've provided to them
Absolutely.
To the FDA or to another regulator saying, hey, is this what you're looking for? So what are some of the testing and things that we see people doing to help them comply with what the FDA or other regulatory agencies are looking for?
I think the challenge is too, right? It's not a defined, criteria that's equal to all clients, because all clients have different configurations, et cetera, et cetera. One could have cloud connectivity, one may not. It depends on how your device is configured and what the ecosystem of that product is, right? So you're responsible as the manufacturer for the upgrading of the software that impacts the cloud or it's the IO ports that are on a product. The bulk of work we do for clients has really been centered around penetration testing of wireless connectivity and of cloud connectivity. And then the second probably most applicable test is testing the IO ports for malformed input test or fuzzing. And that is really dovetails into what the FDA really wants is a vulnerability assessment and understanding what is in that vulnerability assessment. And of that software vulnerability, do you have a plan when that vulnerability escalates to a threat level? And how do you then mitigate that threat level? Is it there for functionality, or is it something you can remove because it's a legacy issue to be determined? But really, at the end of the day, you have to have that plan, of testing, but also the vulnerability assessment and how you're going to how a device manufacturer will manage, the vulnerability assessment. Best advice, the second best advice besides being proactive, I will give is, treat the security testing akin to going to the dentist, where if you have penetration testing done year one, year two, look at what have I changed to my software, and should I do a full retest because I changed my operating system, which is the most extreme thing you're probably going to do, or should I do some spot checking to make sure that I didn't impact the entire ecosystem because I didn't repeat my testing. This year two cost will probably be a lot less than your year one cost, depending upon your provider, but it really should be a very collaborative approach with your provider on your year one and year two costs to understand the potential impact you have on your product.
Yeah, and I think that's a really practical way to look at it, right? Because when you look at, let's say the safety testing or performance testing or EMC testing, yes, the standards change. Yes, the hardware changes sometimes, but not in the same rate and in the same frequency as what we're seeing from all of these external types of cyber threats, the vulnerabilities that might exist. So when you think of it in that way, no, you're not repeating safety testing every year. You're not repeating EMC testing every year because it's not changing that rapidly, right? But when you look at what we're seeing from a cyber perspective or a cyber threat, or from what your vulnerabilities might be, those could be changing from today to tomorrow to 30 days from now.
That's right. There are services out there where you can monitor your vulnerabilities on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, whatever you prescribe to. Not a bad approach as well to have that as part of your plan so that you can see the vulnerabilities as they materialize. It takes it from a very static test report to more of a living document. And the challenge that everyone has in industry is that they see the vulnerability report hit the Wall Street Journal that X product has Y vulnerability. That vulnerability has been a threat for 90 days, and it's been something we didn't know about for 90 days. And then all of a sudden you have to back solve that vulnerability. That proactivity may help manage that vulnerability so you catch it potentially closer on the front end than on the back end, and then you can manage your risk accordingly.
Yeah, so you're keeping this vulnerability. I like that as like a living document, right? Something that you're constantly working on,
Right.
constantly monitoring. And then with the penetration testing, do we recommend the same thing? Is that a annual type activity as well? Is that a biannual, every few years? Like, how do we look at that from both the hardware and a software type perspective?
I personally feel that once a year is probably sufficient if you're not doing major overhaul. The caveat, if you're not doing a major overhaul of your operating system, of your software. If your organization has an acquisitive arm that is purchasing competitors or complementary products, and you do not know what's in that software upon acquisition, that might be a good target for to test that particular product, to understand what the risk, and do a vulnerability assessment as well, so you understand A, what's in that software, and B, can it be hacked. That's something that I think manufacturers, they may be doing, but they don't talk about it. Obviously, it's very strategic, very quiet, and this is very important as well. Make sure you have a set up a very, ironclad NDA with your provider as well, so they're not sharing any secrets, who's it's or what's it's you're out there in the marketplace. That's just a side note. But I think that's the acquisitive nature could, have multiple products being tested at once by providers. But on a product line, I would say once a year is sufficient.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, right? And as with all of this documentation that we see from a risk management perspective for medical device manufacturers, you're constantly doing your post-market surveillance, monitoring activity that's happening in the field, right? All of the things now, cyber is just a part of that process, right? On an ongoing basis, on all of the same things that we're used to doing, but now have to kind of wrap our mind around this other area as well.
Yeah, previously it was largely done in-house, and you would check and balance your in-house network of people working on your software, and there wasn't that the regulatory oversight that now is being asked upon manufacturers. So the challenge is to that as well, as you may not have the tools or the personnel with the proper CVs, or have people with the rights that historically have done penetration testing, and they're accredited to do it. It's not an easy task to have that on your CV. So look for the right person if you're hiring that has the accreditations, but also partner with someone that you can watch the watcher, right? You want to make sure there's a check and balance in your methodology as well. One of my lead analysts will say using 2 pen testers, providers, is not a bad idea. That way one doesn't get complacent. And he's been doing it for 35 years, so I have to trust his judgment on that. But that's probably the best advice as well. Who's watching your watcher?
Well, yeah, and I think too, you think about those people, like that skill set will be in such high demand, right? As we see these major advancements in software. And I think we can look at all of these things as just this stepping stone to the future in med device, right? When we're thinking about AI being incorporated more, when we're thinking about virtual reality, all of these things that we're seeing coming out from a technology space, making sure that this foundation of understanding, monitoring, regulating, improving cybersecurity, all will just play into each of those things in the future.
100%. And I think there's other verticals outside of medical that are having similar challenges. Medical is the first one to have these very unique challenges, but the marketplace, AI is going to be unilateral for all manufacturing. And I think that it's the amount of people needed to handle the influx of work is going to be greater than I think we know today.
Yeah, coming fast and furious. So we mentioned the document that the FDA just put out, the right of refusal document, end of March, beginning of April. We had their other guideline document that came out in 2022, right? So all of that information is available, readily accessible from the FDA's website. Are there other documents that people should be aware of or looking at when they're thinking about the FDA specifically, or other groups?
I would say other countries as well. There's we talked about in my last visit, Clarissa, we talked about the EU MDR very specifically in Annex 1. And as the MDR continues to evolve, we have had clients today that their registrar has given them corrective action and their essential requirements because they don't have cybersecurity. So again, an ounce of prevention was a pound of cure. So you have to really, as my grandmother would tell me, you really have to go through and assess, are you ready for MDR? And in so many avenues, right? It's not just cybersecurity, it's greater than, but the sum of all parts. This is an element that if you think you have everything, that's great. How do you check and balance that? That's great. The testing element in the European Union's MDR is one unique paragraph of verification and validation. And it talks about if you have wireless, then do a pen test. The nice part is you do the pen test once, you validate it for the EU. The challenge is the process and procedure aspect of cybersecurity is not consistent across the spectrum. So you have to follow their guidance and make sure you're populating their paragraphs uniquely for the European Union. And just to add to that, Japan just came out with new requirements as well.
They did.
Yes, they did. I was over there in April, and in April they launched the requirements. They announced in April, will become effective next April, where you have to have a penetration test. And they want there's a document they want you to follow, which is a guidance document, IEC 81001-5, I believe, and which is a very strong document. But if you read through that document uniquely, it also dovetails into the IEC 62443 document, which is also dovetails back to the European Union document for cybersecurity. So, understanding how these frameworks are created, picking an avenue that's going to be the best economies of scale from a process perspective, from a managerial perspective, is probably the best advice I'll give as well, because you have to understand you want to do it once, but you're going to have to have some splinter factions, if you would, at the unique country level. But the IEC 62443 seems to be a very, very pervasive document with device manufacturers and device regulators, excuse me.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting too, right? Because even the last time you were on as a guest, right, 6-7 months ago, we were having this discussion saying, hey, we got to be looking to the future. We know these countries are going to be following suit. We know it's going to be MDR. We know it's going to be FDA. We know we're going to see other countries starting to put these guidances, regulations into place, following each other, right? As we typically see in a regulatory space, right? We see a lot of other countries follow along with either what the EU is doing or what the US is doing. So it is interesting now to see that this is all coming to fruition, right? Exactly what we talked about, that, okay, now we're seeing countries, it's not just a do your best, do your due diligence. Now it's like, do your best, but do these things to make sure you're doing it. That's correct. And even the other evolution that's occurred in the past 2 months, the IMDRF came out with a guidance document on legacy products and how to end a life of product. And it's a tremendous read. And it really goes through, at what point does a manufacturer say, I am no longer going to support the software and the patching of that software for that device? And that dovetails into your cybersecurity. So it culminates together from taking care of, understanding your processes and procedures, understanding when you have your testing done, understanding, what you have to submit at the regulatory level, and then ultimately it's going to lead you to the end of life of a product. Yeah, and I think that's something that's so important for medical manufacturers as well, because we see so much M&A in this space, right? We see so many people either acquiring existing technology or legacy products, or we see people acquiring companies that maybe you don't have all of the information or the documentation on these products, on how the software is developed on an ongoing basis, right? So it makes it really challenging. So how do you take some of these products that you have no intention of bringing forward? How do you end of life them? Or, take something and develop something new out of that. Or even if you subcontract the development of your software, and how do you put constraints on the subcontractor to make sure they're doing what you have to document? Absolutely. So it really is a very interesting time for the medical device sector, because there are a lot of questions we have about, should I test all these standards? And in my opinion, look for the economies of scale. If you're doing a vulnerability assessment, that is being asked of by Japan or by the European Union or by the US, once you have that vulnerability assessment, via the NIST, we use the NIST known vulnerabilities database, you have that information. But how you process it and how you submit it to the regulators is very key. Don't do it 3 times. If you're being asked to do it 3 times, it might be overkill, right? So do it once and get it done right the first time. Absolutely. As Dr. Schwartz of the FDA has said, it's better to plan for it than plug it in, which is a great tagline. That's a fantastic tagline. And I think, there's just going to be so much more that we'll see out of not only the FDA, but the other regulatory agencies, and so much more we'll learn over the next 2, 3, 6, months and years. So I think we'll definitely be having you back on soon, I'm sure. It would be my pleasure. I love these conversations. You and I can go all day long. I think there's also developments I have to read up on in Brazil as well. But I think what I'm seeing and what I sense is, if you harken back to 4 or 5 years ago when the medical device single audit program came out, I think all those MDSAP countries are really aligning with the IMDRF and with the FDA. So you have to be cognizant that your audit trail is going to be incorporated with some cybersecurity challenges as well. Yeah, so very very moving space, right? Very ever-changing space. So I'm sure we'll have lots
highly
of
fluid.
discussions.
Yeah,
Yes, highly fluid. Yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Anything else you want to leave everybody with before we end today?
Well, I just, as I said earlier, to recap, the three real critical things is one, be proactive. It will benefit you and your organization. I had a former boss tell me that stress happens when things aren't planned and orderly. So please, be proactive. Understand that just because you have a non-wireless device, you will have to have some type of software plan, if you would. And lastly, understand that the regulations are changing very quickly. So don't, if you're getting frustrated and you're uncertain what to do, ask the question, right? You have to ask your current providers, ask the regulators, and have a dialogue, because they're there to help and help you through this process.
Yeah, everybody learning from each other. Absolutely. So
absolutely.
Really, really fantastic to have you on today, George. Appreciate your time.
Great.
Yes. Again,
really
we'll be chatting soon about all of these things. And if anyone has questions for George or would like to get in touch, please let us know and we'll be happy to connect you. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining today.
Thank you, Clarissa.
Yeah. Thanks, George.
Bye now.